Hello everyone, my name is Roy Jafari and I would like to welcome you to another video. In this video, our focus is still going to be on the ethical aspects of data modeling. In this video, we are going to discuss supervised models and we are going to discuss it from an ethical perspective. Alright, so let's learn what is a supervised model first and then learn about the ethical aspects of it. So the supervised model are basically any model that has a dependent attribute or a target that we are trying to predict it, right? So when we have this dynamic, we want to use the independent attributes to find the relationship with a dependent attribute and try to predict it. That's a supervised model. We have seen this in prediction and classification. So we have the supervised models for prediction and classification. And the only difference between prediction and classification, as we've seen, is that for prediction, our target is a numerical attribute, but for the classification, our target is a label or a category. So that's the only difference between prediction and classification, and they are supervised models. But unsupervised model, an example of that is clustering. Clustering does not have a target. Basically, we try to see the patterns inside the data, and our goal is not to find those relationships to be able to predict the target. So in a very high level case, we can separate the supervised and unsupervised learning by this definition. With supervised learning, we have the goal of predicting a target. With unsupervised learning, we don't have such goals. We don't have that agenda that we have those numbers to sort of reach ourselves to them, but we have an agenda to find the inherent patterns in the data. And because we don't have that value to supervise ourselves against, or sort of see the evaluations of our prediction against, then that task becomes unsupervised. So in this video, we're going to focus on the ethical aspects of supervised models. The example we are going to focus on in this video is a classification example. And the discussion for a prediction example would be very similar to a classification example. So in this example, we want to use these independent attributes. Let me show them here. We want to use these independent attributes, right? So these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dependent attributes to predict this target. This is our target and that's our goal. This is our prediction task, the classification task we want to perform. So let's get back to our general model theory to sort of recognize these three elements of this model: mapping, reduction, and pragmatism. What are we mapping here? We're mapping students, right? So we are, these students, there are so many different things about them. We are mapping them by the reduction of the students into these attributes, right? So the students are now represented by these attributes. And there is a difference between the types of attributes in this model, right? In the clustering models, we only had attributes, right? It didn't matter what type of attribute. Here we have independent attributes and a dependent attribute, right? So, of course, the dependent attribute or target is, of highly importance to this model because we want to be able to predict that, right? So, this is assumption. We are reducing the importance of a student to this target. So this becomes the most important attribute. And next to that, these independent attributes are also very important as opposed to the possible independent attributes that are not in this model, right? So we are reducing these students into these dependent and independent attributes. And what is the pragmatism part? It is useful to be able to evaluate students for admission decision, for school admission decision, right? So that could be useful in those areas. So now let's talk about the ethical dimensions of modeling. Like any other models, we always have to be aware that this is a model. We do not want to rely too much on this model. So this is something that you always have to pay attention when you engage in these reduction of entities such as individuals. You always have to remember that this is just a model. We also need to have efforts to make sure that all of the implicit assumptions are explicit so we can analyze them and discuss them and let the person who's going to be using these models to be aware of these assumptions. So what are some assumptions? These are only examples. There could be more assumptions. So for instance, the first assumption is that the only important factor for decision making is the target, is the prospect of the finding a job 5 months after graduation, right? So this is assumed that this is the most important factor about the decision making. If we were to use this model for direct decision making, and then also we're assuming if we are including or excluding some attributes here, it's not going to create fairness concerns, right? So for instance, here in this example, let me get back here. If we were to, for instance, include the zip code or not zip code, would it create equity concerns? Would we be favoring some part of the population over the other? So that's a good question to think about. So these are the assumptions. We also want to make sure that, like I said, these assumptions are always at the forefront of our thinking, and whoever it is that is going to be using this model up the chain, communication up the chain of commands, whoever is going to be using this model, they have to be aware of these models, these assumptions. At the same time, we will be using these assumptions in our cost benefit analysis. So we also want to pay attention to the costs of our assumptions. So for instance, the cost of the first assumption could be described as, when we make our decisions based on this one target, we are saying that the other aspects, such as access to education or equity of the education, become less important or become zero. They will have zero importance. That is the cost of using such model. Another cost could be described as, for the second assumption, is that including an attribute or excluding one of these attributes that we've included is not going to have any equity and fairness concerns. So these are the assumptions that we are making when we implement such models. Another thing is we want to be clear exactly how this model is useful, the pragmatism part. And in this case, it can be useful in two, we can think of its usefulness in two different realms. The first one is we can make admission decisions that are creating more long-term success for the institution, right? So if our students as a university go find jobs, they become more successful, they become a more successful alumni of the institution, they will have donations. So this will create a more long-term sustainable success for the institution. Also, it can make the admission decisions much more efficient. I mean, the efficiency we mean here is we are going to spend less amount of resources, such as admission office personnel's resources, or the resources of going through these applications from the department. So all of those can be reduced, and so we will have a more efficient decision-making process. So these are the benefits. How about the cost-benefit analysis? We just talked about these benefits and the costs. We've already talked about them, but just to go over them, we will have some real concerns about the equitable access to these education. And of course, we did see that if we were to include or exclude some attributes, this could create favoritism towards some part of the population. And like any other models, this model also is subject to misusing, abusing, and overusing. So we want to make sure that what we are giving up, what we are gaining, there is a balance. So we want to make sure that we are getting more benefit than the cost. And also we want to pay attention, the benefit and the cost are equitable, right? We don't want just for the university to be successful. If it's a public university, it's funded by the government, the costs that are created for the people or for the students should be paid more weight or should be paid more attention to. But to finish this video, let's talk about some of the examples of abusing, overusing, and misusing, right? So an example of overusing and misusing would be, thinking that this model is, the best way to decide who should be admitted, right? You don't take any other factors in. You just have a very strict automated decision making based just on this model. That would be a case of overusing, because there might be aspects to students that this model is not capturing, and there might be aspects to students that we cannot even measure, right? So that needs to be paid attention to. Also, we want to check when we create these prediction models for making decisions about people. We want to check if our inclusion or exclusion of some of these attributes are going to have a significant impact on a certain population, right? For instance, we can check for race, we can check for gender, we can check for zip code. We want to see if inclusions of these attributes are going to create equitable concerns, right? So that would be another thing we want to pay attention to. What would be an example of abusing? It would be very simple for someone who is creating this model to intentionally, if it's intentional, right? To intentionally include or exclude attributes to favor or to sort of like make it harder for some part of the population to be admitted to higher quality schools. All right, until the next video.